I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may.
Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone and you're watching The Daily Question. Today's question of the day: why should every supporter of the Me Too movement watch Out of Thin Air? Now, Out of Thin Air, for those who haven't seen it, is a crime documentary movie that is available on Netflix, or it certainly is in my country. It is a really, really good documentary film. It's one of those documentary films that where there's real craft has been put into the documentary making. It's not just a group of people being interviewed and a bit of a story that's being told. They actually have, there's a cinematography to it, there's an artistic sort of beauty that really enhances and gets, I think, to perhaps the emotional core of the story. The way the narrative is structured also is really important. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But basically, Out of Thin Air tells the story about the disappearance of two men in the 1970s in Iceland. And these two disappearances subsequently became murder investigations, and a group of young people were arrested. They confessed to the murders, they were found guilty, they spent time in prison, but then as the documentary carries on, we discover that things aren't actually as they first appear. And this is one of the things where the narrative and the way that the documentary is narratively told it really makes all the difference in the world. So what it does is it starts with the initial introduction to Iceland in the 70s, and then quickly gets into the two disappearances. And then it introduces a couple of key players who are involved in this whole story. And then it gets to the arrest and the confessions. And then the subsequent trial and the fact that they go to jail. And you think, as a viewer, you're watching this, and if you don't know anything about the actual story and what happened around these murders, you look at this and you go, okay, this is pretty sort of straightforward. This is a very well-told crime documentary about a pretty horrible situation where a group of young people, for whatever reason, did this morally reprehensible thing, and they killed two people in Iceland. They confessed to the crime and they're in jail, case closed. And just as you're sort of starting to think that way, all of a sudden the narrative of the documentary shifts and it introduces you to all the important facts that you need to know about the case and the way in particular these confessions were elicited. And what you realise is pretty quickly that, oh my gosh, this is actually a very serious miscarriage of justice that has taken place here. And this is very much, why the narrative of this documentary and the way it's told is so important is because this is pretty much probably the way people would have experienced it in the 70s. You have this sense of certainty that the right outcome has been reached here, that you know, justice has been served, that the innocence of the victims has, I guess, been preserved and protected. You know, that there has been a just outcome, that their killers have been found, that the people who were guilty, that justice has been served and they are now in jail. And very much like the public of the day, it's very much how the sort of the certainty of these decisions and these verdicts, it's very much how they would have seen them. But then subsequently, as more information comes to light, you discover that this case is not so clear-cut, and in actual fact there are some very, very serious problems here. And so narratively it's just so well told. It's a very good documentary. But why I think this is so important for people who are supporters of the Me Too movement is because of the actual substance of the story that lies at the heart of this documentary. And what you have is a group of young people who are coerced into their confessions. And the reason they are coerced into their confessions is because of the fact that there is a public hysteria that has arisen around these two disappearances and, you know, these subsequent murder investigations. And there is this hysteria that justice must be done, the case must be solved, and that this evil must be dealt with. And what happens is this hysteria is fueled by the media. It finds itself all the way to the highest levels of politics in Iceland. And it is very much something that is fueled and is perpetrated by the actions of law enforcement. So the judiciary, the police officers, the courts, and everyone else who is involved in this case. Now, what's interesting is that these young people who confess to these crimes, some of them are now dead. Some of their stories are actually quite tragic, but the way in which they confess to their crimes is brought about because of the fact that they are subjected to so many interrogations, a huge, disproportionately huge number of interrogations, and interrogations that go for very long periods of time. Not only that, but they're also being tortured by the prison guards during this process as well, like including at least one of them who is actually having his head dunked into a sink full of water with obviously the threat of drowning. So there's this form of water torture going on, sleep deprivation. It gets so bad, in fact, that two of the suspects just basically, they become so unhinged. One of them has to start receiving medical sedation to sort of bring him out of this situation or this scenario. Another one attempts suicide on 2 different occasions. There's a female suspect who was convicted, and she has a young baby at the time of this court case and this investigation, and yet she is so psychologically detached from the truth of her own life and from reality that she actually starts to doubt whether she even has a child. She starts to believe that she doesn't even have a child. That's not even true. And in actual fact, it is absolutely true that she has a young baby daughter. But she's so psychologically confused by this process. The documentary, the experts in the documentary talk about the fact that these young people very much were beginning to experience what they call memory distrust syndrome. And that is where a person no longer trusts their own memory. They no longer believe that what their memories are telling them are actually true. They can't trust their own memory, and that makes them extremely susceptible. And so effectively what happens is once the police, through this long and involved process of interrogations, start leading them and telling them what they've done, they just start confessing to anything because they're that psychologically broken. Now, all the warning signs are there that these confessions should have been questioned. First of all, there's no bodies ever found. They still don't have the bodies of these 2 disappeared men. They don't know what happened to them. So they still, to this day, they don't have their bodies. So that's a really, really important point. It's sort of hard to corroborate sort of the forensic aspects of a crime when you don't have much in the way of forensic evidence to go on. Secondly, the stories and the confessions, they kept changing, like in big ways. So one version of the confession is they are beating one of these men to death. In another version of the confession, the female actually stands over this man and she shoots and kills him with a rifle. Very, very different stories going on there. And this should have raised very, very serious red flags about what was going on. But instead, there was this hysteria. They had to solve the case. They had to get justice. There had to be the outcome they wanted. So they bring in someone who effectively his role becomes to make all of these sort of disparities in the confessions all fit and make sense and to try and make a case out of it. And it's absolutely astounding when you look at the scenario of what happened here. But here's the big thing. It was driven by this public hysteria. Now, the public hysteria is not motivated by anything bad. They are motivated by a genuine desire to see justice done. They are motivated by a desire to see society protected from evil. They are motivated by a desire to actually ensure that their society is protected from this happening again. These are all very good and pure motivations. But unfortunately, hysteria, and fueled very much by the media, had kicked up, and this became like a witch hunt. And people stopped thinking rationally, and they stopped thinking morally. Now, this is a real danger that I think is very much present in the Me Too movement, because the Me Too movement is very much motivated by pure intentions. It's about addressing the evil of predatory sexual behaviour. So whether that's sort of the lower end of the spectrum where someone is engaged in sexual harassment or discrimination in the workplace, to the more extreme end of the spectrum where someone commits acts of rape or sexual assault. And these are very serious evils, and we don't want these things to be able to be perpetrated very easily in our society. We want, particularly those perhaps who've been getting away with them under a cloak of anonymity, or they haven't been brought to justice, to actually be brought to justice. That's a very pure and good intention to have. However, the way things are going at the moment, where effectively the media is continually fueling and driving this thing and encouraging people to just step forward and make their allegations, just make your allegations in the public square, you can end up with some really, really dangerous and bad outcomes. And you end up with a scenario where, just like in this case, innocent people can end up paying the ultimate price because that hysteria has been whipped up. And people are not actually stopping to question whether or not what is even being said here is actually true anymore. Even in the last week or so in my country here in New Zealand, there was an article in the newspapers on the weekend about a woman who made a false rape allegation. This is actually a lot more common than people think. Now, I don't want to disparage genuine victims of sexual assault or predatory sexual behaviour. It's not every victim, but this does happen. And it is something that you need to be aware of, and particularly when you kick up a public hysteria about something and you create almost like a media-driven search for perpetrators, the chances of false allegations being made actually become greater in that very, very situation. So you've got to be very, very careful about this. And so in this case, this woman, this man had broken up with her. She was angry about the fact that he had broken up with her, and so she accused him falsely of rape. And this went on for months. He was accused of rape, and it was all made up. It wasn't true. There was another case in the last year in this country where a young girl had accused a teacher of sexual abuse, but it was false, and it came out in the court case. It's quite conceivable if this hadn't have come out, if she hadn't have actually said, yeah, I made it up, then it's quite conceivable that he would have gone to jail. He would have been convicted for a crime that he never committed. Now, this is one of the dangers when you create these public movements to try and root out immorality. There's a real danger that you can lose sight of morality itself in your quest to try and bring about justice and to root out immorality. It is very, very, very important to stop and ask those questions. Well, are we actually helping to facilitate a movement that potentially is going to do a whole lot of harms that are not good in our society, in our zeal, in our desire to try and address other harms? And if so, how do we temper that risk? How do we temper that problem? How do we actually address the question of predatory sexual behaviour and improving that aspect of our society without also destroying other important aspects of society, stable society and a just civil order in the process? And that's why I think this film, Out of Thin Air, is so very, very important for this moment in history right now. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's a very, very well-made documentary about a very, very important subject. And it really gets to the heart of this topic in a very profound and intelligent way. It's well worth your time. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comment section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please support me on Patreon or PayPal. The links for both are in the description below. That's right, I can hear my theme music too. I'll see you tomorrow on The Daily Question.